So Sheri, I am so grateful that you're willing to sit with me and do this recording because I want to share first how we met. I was doing a class on international real estate and you were there and we had conversation about the issue of translation and it was very interesting for me because clearly that's what you do. That's not just what you do, other things as well, but you had a depth of understanding of the issue of translation, especially I look at the global real estate market all the time. I do a lot of work and training people how to be better at global real estate. And the way you spoke and what you had to say, I think just became like, man, I have to do a video with this lady because she's going to add some value to those of you out in the world that are going to watch this video on what do I do when I want to get a translator and when should I have a translator? And so that's what we're here to talk. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you taking the time to be with me today.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to share in any way I can.
I appreciate it, Sheri. So first I want to ask you, how did this happen for you? How did you become a translator? And what languages do you translate, if you don't mind?
I kind of fell into becoming an interpreter, translator over 20 years ago. It wasn't something that I set out to do. In most interpreters and translators, it's not a profession you set out to do. You need to have a lot of other knowledge before you can actually do the job in many different industries. Because if you don't understand what is being presented, you can't interpret it.
Brilliantly said. Absolutely. And that was the trigger for me. I heard you say that. I said, good point. Because if you don't understand the thing that you're working on, how are you going to be able to interpret it? Correct me if I'm wrong, and explain it so the other side of the deal, whatever deal it may be, understands. Is that correct? Is that a fair statement?
Well,
Ish.
Well, not the other side of the deal, but the other language, language.
So share a little bit on that, if you don't mind, please.
So just some clarification, interpreting is oral translation, what people think of. Translation is written form. So both have there are different skills that you have to have in both. When you're translating a document with writing to writing, that's one thing. When you're interpreting, with hearing someone speak one language and putting it into the other and then bringing it back into the same language, those are other skills. I interpret English, Spanish only. The other languages I'm learning, I'm not proficient enough yet to be at that level, maybe one day, but it's something that it's fascinating. And it's challenging because with interpreting, you need to think in two languages if you're interpreting simultaneously and be speaking at the same time. If consecutive mode of interpreting is where someone speaks a couple sentences, you stop, you interpret it to the target language and back and forth. There are, depending upon the situation and what we're in, especially in real estate, it would depend upon the type of interpreting or translation that would need to be done.
It's just so fascinating for me. I can remember many years ago, this goes back, where I was watching, I want to say it might have been NATO, a meeting, and I'm hearing the English is being spoken on the podium, and there's a person in somebody's ear listening and immediately trying, like, I can't even. And I just find it so amazing and fascinating. And I'm just, it's like, you really are, your head is in two places at the same time. Is that a fair interpretation?
You have to think in two languages, and you're hearing and speaking, and it's intense. But once you get that skill mastered, it's actually very easy.
Well, yeah.
Once you get it mastered.
Right. That's right.
Takes
So
a lot of practice.
I'm sure. So let's talk about real estate. When we look at the job of an interpreter, not necessarily the translation of the contracts, but the job of the interpreter in the real estate purchase process, if you will, where do
Mhm.
you think, what, just talk a little tiny bit about what is that like and what is the job? And because one of the things I recall, I said something along the creating a relationship, but that isn't it.
No,
So
no.
share a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, on that, because that's really an important piece to this.
Yes, as the interpreter, you are neutral to everything. You are to remain neutral to everything. Now, you can build a business relationship if you get to maybe do future business with that particular interpreter, fine, but that interpreter is not part of the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
They do not, it's not about building relationships with either side of the transaction.
Does that,
So,
does that ever get checked? No, no, you can't. You're in business. This is what you do. You just, right? Am I right? It's what you do.
well, that can get skewed with certain, I mean, if people haven't received enough training, if particular interpreters haven't received enough training, there could be challenges, but I would strongly recommend you get a highly trained interpreter, because real estate vocabulary and processes are not part of the usual speech and even the usual interpreting locations and speech that interpreters are usually called to.
Well, yeah, that we talked about that in CIPS, because the way business is done in Spain or the way business is done in South America, pick a country, is not the way it's done here. And so you're, and please, so the process is you're called in to help someone. Let's pretend it's someone in North Carolina,
Okay.
and you have a buyer from, pick a Spanish speaking country, who is wanting to buy. You're called in to help them understand the process. So talk a tiny about that, because my brain goes, having years in management, my brain goes immediately into risk management. So it's so vitally important. That's where my brain goes. So
That's
vitally
good, because
important.
there is risk.
Now, of course there is, because if, yeah. So talk about that, Sheri, because that's just like,
So,
wow.
so let's say, let me give you two different scenarios. So let's make it a realtor who does not speak Spanish, and the client only speaks Spanish coming in. Now, I don't explain anything. I only repeat what is said.
Mm.
So if that realtor does not explain everything, that doesn't get communicated.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's very, very important that the realtor who speaks English is explaining everything very clearly. Additionally, that one very important thing is that they avoid colloquialisms if possible, slang, some of that. I mean, there are translations for some of that, some it doesn't exist in the target language, but at the same time, it complicates things. And this is a complicated process. So if we're looking at a buyer buying in the US, you're having to explain how this transaction is done
Mhm.
in the US. And now they're looking at the processes and thinking of processes in their home country.
Mhm.
And in their mind, they're comparing notes, and it's like, well, why, and they may actually question certain things. They may question and challenge you. Why don't you use your influence, i.e. pay bribes to the listing agent to get them a house? So, I mean, and there will be many ways or points along the transaction where you have to explain a lot of things.
That just, I'm so glad we're doing this. That just was fascinating because you're a realtor, but you
Mhm.
cannot get involved in the realtor that is selling the property and influence in any way. Your job is to just, how many times does your head just become an exploding head emoji?
There are many times I want to pull my hair out.
I can imagine. Wow.
But one thing, being, I am unique in that I am a professional interpreter and I am a licensed realtor. There's liability on in both paths, major liability. Obviously, as part of risk management, there are very few of us who are professional interpreters and realtors. One thing is we learn to separate where we wear our hats,
Right.
and which hat we're wearing at what time.
Mhm.
My brokerage is actually have me have disclosure that states that I am also a professional interpreter. However, I'm not acting that way with them, even though I may be speaking Spanish. You know, for me, I would be just speaking Spanish to them. However, I will not be interpreting what the lender says, nor what the closing attorney says.
Right.
There, they will need to get someone else as their interpreter,
So
or which I can help them get.
so you can guide them to somebody, but it's very much like that you heard me say this when we were going through CIPS. You're not a tax person. You're
Nope.
not any of those things. Your job is one thing and one thing only. You can't be both things in the same deal. Sorry for the barking. We're going to leave it in the video. It makes it better. And so you can be one thing in the deal. You can't be both things in the deal. I love that. I love that. That's got to be so hard. It's so hard. So talk to me, please, or talk to the group. What should someone look for? And I know you mentioned before, and I'm going to, at the end, I'm going to add some contact information for you so that people can reach out to you and you can potentially guide them to agencies who have interpreters on their teams. But what should someone look for when hiring an interpreter?
For real estate, I would strongly recommend you look for someone who has credentials, registered with, say, the courts, or I would look for a court interpreter first, because court interpreters have had the strictest tests. And if they're on the rosters with the courts, they have been tested a lot in both languages, or whichever languages they're speaking in. And but even still, real estate is not a common place that we interpret yet.
Right.
In time, that may change, but it is something that the bottom line is who pays the bill.
Right.
That's probably why we're not so much in the real estate industry yet, because of the cost. And these services, there aren't apps out there. Google does not translate correctly. So you really do need to have a human, ideally on site with you, to be able to see the body language and things. So it's challenging, but that would be where I would start, depending upon if you are helping the buyer or seller in this country to buy or sell in the US. That I would definitely start there. If you are helping someone buy or sell outside of the US, the foreign country may provide their own interpreter.
Okay.
Possibly, but being this is a transaction,
Right.
I would strongly recommend having your own interpreter to oversee or listen and make sure things are being interpreted correctly, and to be able to discreetly point out when they're not.
Discreetly.
Well, because depending upon where you are in the negotiations or the transaction or what the situation is, the interpreter, we're technically invisible. I mean, we're not invisible, but we're kind of like a telephone. It's there, but it's not there.
Mhm.
So in this sort of situation, we're providing the communication back and forth. But so in a case where we do get hired in those situations, to listen to other interpreters to verify that the
Ah,
information is passed correctly. And literally that is what in those situations, our job is to just be there and listen.
mm, mm,
And
mm. So, but so if you get hired to help that person buying in the US, you're in that transaction probably from the time it starts to the time it closes. Is that a fair assumption?
that would be probably the wise way to plan it.
And then I just heard you say, if I'm buying a home and I want to buy a home in a Spanish speaking country, you're also somebody I can call and say, I want to make sure that what I'm being told is correct for my understanding.
Well, if you don't speak that, Spanish or whichever country, if you don't speak that language, the agent there may or may not provide an interpreter.
Mhm.
It fall, it falls on the individual, buyer to figure out how are you going to know what is being said.
Yeah, that's
And it's
it is. I think it's fabulous, and I'm a big proponent of global real estate, and that the world is a tiny thing, and interconnectivity. And I was just doing some research, and I know that even though we have issues of still with the pandemic, I'm not necessarily seeing a long-term change in people still wanting to buy homes. The world is just, it's a marble. And so
Mhm.
I think that growth in real estate is going to be certainly a bigger thing in terms of interpretation. I have one more question. I know you're in North Carolina, so the agencies that you're familiar with, are they able to provide like a Zoom-based interpreter? Doesn't matter what. So you're not translating the paperwork, you're listening and talking. Listing agent is saying things, you're picking that in and throwing it back out in the language of the native speaker. Uh,
Yes, it can be done via Zoom. It can be done over the phone. Phone is obviously a much more difficult situation, and especially with people wearing masks
Right.
nowadays, it makes it even more challenging. However, in both cases, if there are documents to be site translated, those usually prior to the meeting would be provided to the interpreter, and so that they could review it and then have a copy in front of them, then to be able to to look at it and interpret it into the language just from viewing it.
Very, very logical thing. If is there any one thing that maybe we haven't talked about or touched on that you think should be shared with our audience when I finish getting this video posted?
Well, maybe a couple. COVID, obviously, that has changed some things. People need to be aware that for us to do our job, we normally stand literally right next to and are whispering into a person's ear.
Ah, never knew that.
Or we can't do our job 6 feet away.
Wow.
Because we would be over, our volume would go over everybody's and we wouldn't be able to, it just wouldn't work.
Wow.
So if one challenge for the future with that is equipment, the need for interpreter equipment in more locations, which that might be something that people need to keep in mind. And then with that equipment, we could be wherever, in the same room or adjoining room or however, but even just, 6 feet apart, but whispering into the equipment and they would hear us.
Oh, that's perfect.
So that is another tool that we have available.
And then you said there were a couple of things. So what's
Yes,
another?
another thing would be, if you're going on the global scale, you you have to worry about politics in other countries,
Hmm.
and your interpreters, are they, I guess, how controlled is there, how controlled are the interpreters by their governments? So that might, depending upon the country or what's happening in that country
Yes, yes.
at that particular time, you know, interpreters' lives are in danger a
Wow.
lot more than people think,
Wow.
just because of what we repeat
Right.
and what we hear as it goes through us.
Wow.
So that's where, like, right, there, the for example, the Afghanistan interpreters
Situation. Sure.
and
Yeah.
being in danger.
Yep.
Um, I mean, myself, I've been in situations in interpreting for drug
Oh,
cases. So I mean, there's a whole different, it's a whole different world, but something as simple as a real estate transaction may not be so simple,
so,
even
so
as we know in real estate.
wow. And yeah, that's, I don't know that I want to know about the drug deal part, Sheri. I'm not sure I want.
No, we don't want to go there, but I'm just talking about real estate. Even with real estate,
Right.
it adds more layers of
Yes.
complication
Yes.
that will potentially create some challenges.
Well, it takes me to, you mentioned it earlier, use your influence and culture. And in some cultures that would almost be a normal request. Use your influence to make it work. And so
I've had that said to me.
I'm
That's why
sure,
I said that.
you know,
And
cultural mores, country to country. It's fascinating. And, obviously this has been so awesome and I've learned things which I so love. And I knew this was going to be a fascinating video. And I'm just grateful. And what I may do, because what I'm doing with most of the videos I'm working on now, I'm trying to bring something unique to the table for everybody that will watch. And what I'm doing with others is I may come up with another thought or an idea, and I might reach out to you again and say, can we do another one and focus on this thing? Are you open to doing that?
sure,
I love
sure,
it. Well,
absolutely.
I appreciate you so much. I'm so glad I got to meet you in North Carolina from California, and got to spend some time with you and just got to hear you are exactly what I expected for this video. I'm beyond thrilled and I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much, Sheri. I look
Thank
forward to
you.
finishing this up and sending it off to you.
Thank you. And thank you for everything, with the CIPS class. It was an absolute pleasure and honor to be in your class. And I'm just looking forward to continued adventure of global real estate.
You and me both. I've done a lot more research. In fact, I'm doing a CIPS for Delaware coming up. I'm in the middle of one right now. And there's new stuff that I have to talk about. There are things that have to be shared. And that's what I get obsessed with and usually start at around 5 in the morning, like, wow, look at that. Wow, look at this. I can't help myself. But it was great to meet you. And I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you again, Sheri. Take good care. And I wish you a wonderful week.
Likewise.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Sheri.
Thank you.
So that was the first time I'd ever gotten the chance to speak to someone who does what Sheri does. She's also a practicing realtor. It's not just translation, but I just find it absolutely fascinating to have a better understanding of the job of an interpreter. And as we still continue to grow in international real estate, we have to pay attention. We may need to find an interpreter, and now you have a little bit better understanding of how it works. Sheri's contact information is on the screen. Please write it down. Reach out to her. She's always generous in her time and happy to answer questions. And I'll see you next time.